The bass was loud with morning drills, boots pounding against the gravel, the sharp bark of commands echoing off the barracks walls, and yet inside the low gray admin building silence ruled, broken only by the soft rhythm of keys clicking in pages. Turning and in that quiet, Lieutenant Rachel Keene hunched over a stack of reports, her eyes moving quickly, her fingers scribbling notes with a precision that matched the rifles on the range outside, her uniform crisp, her posture perfect, and her expression unreadable, as if no sound could reach her unless it arrived in triplicate. He called her paper soldier, not to her face, but often enough that she heard it whispered behind her back, always in the mess hall or by the lockers, or when she passed a group of combat vets, too proud to imagine a warrior might sit behind a desk instead of a turret. Her reputation was clean to clean, no combat record, no medals, no scars, just files and forms and a wall of efficiency they mistook for weakness. They thought she was a regulation robot built for paper work, not for battle, but what they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was the mark hidden beneath her sleeve, just high enough to escape casual notice, a string of black ink etched with care and pain, a silent tally that ran along the inside of her wrist like a scar that never bled, not numbers exactly, but symbols, small sharp slashes arranged in rows and columns, each one a memory, each one a name, a breath she had taken. Well, someone else lost theirs. The major arrived without warning, flown in from division command to conduct evaluations and readiness assessments, a man of reputation and combat grit, a leader known for slicing through incompetence like a blade through soft armor. And when he walked into admin with his boots still dusty and his face weathered from years of sun and war, he looked around with clear contempt. This, he muttered, is where soldiers go to collect paychecks and avoid dirt. Keene did not flinch. When he entered, she rose, offered a salute crisp and sharp, and returned to her work without comment, her presence unshaken, her task uninterrupted, and that caught his attention because he was used to people reacting to his presence with either fear or arrogance, but she showed neither, only focus, only calm, and he watched her work for a long minute, saying nothing as the other officers shifted and fidgeted like children under a stern teacher's eye. Was she, asked finally without looking away. Captain Durand coughed slightly. Paper soldier, sir, good at logistics, runs the numbers tight, but not a field, a set field asset, the major repeated, eyes narrowing as if the words tasted sour. Where's her fillet? Was handed the file within seconds and read through it quickly, flipping pages with a grunt. Here and there he saw the medals for admin excellence, the commendations for efficiency, the letters of recommendation from superiors praising her for structure and discipline, but none of it explained the stillness, the stormless calm that radiated off her like armor. None of it said why his gut told him something about her was being hidden or buried. Had closed the file and approached her desk, slow measured steps, and then stood across from her, arms folded. What did you do before this, Lieutenant? She looked up and replied in a voice clear and even, classified, sir. Classified? Huh, funny how that word covers everything from coffee runs to black ops. Said nothing, just met his eyes with the quiet steadiness of someone who had nothing to prove and no need to defend, and that silence weighed more than any protest could have. It was about to walk away, write her off like the others had, when he noticed her adjusting her sleeve ever so slightly, and in that half second of movement something caught his eye, something on her wrist, a pattern not random, not decorative, and he paused, leaned slightly forward, and asked. Mayish hesitated, then nodded and slowly pulled back the sleeve. Major stared, his face hardening, not with suspicion but with recognition. He knew what those marks meant, not just what they were but what they cost. He had seen them before, rarely and only on certain men in certain places. Those marks were not for show, they were not for pride, they were for memory, for debt, for ghosts that followed too close to outrun. Looked at her again, really looked, and this time he didn't see the uniform or the desk or the file. He saw the silence, the precision, the control, and he realized what kind of soldier she really was. Not the kind who chased glory, but the kind who survived, the kind who had been forged not in training but in fire and lost. Stepped back, gave her a short nod, and turned to the others. With a tone that cut through the air like a blade, "This one's no paper soldier," he said. "This one's been places. Most of you wouldn't last in our island." From that moment, everything changed. The Major left the admin building with the look of a man dragging a memory back from the grave, his jaw set, his steps stiff, the weight of what he had seen on her wrist still pressing on his mind, and he did not speak until he reached the command tent where the other officers waited, assuming his silence meant disapproval, but when he finally spoke, his voice was colder than the wind sweeping off the tarmac. "She's coming with us," he said. "No room for argument." Captain Duran frowned. "Sir, with respect, she's not even in the rotation for deployment, and Intel has her marked strictly support, and Intel is blind." The Major snapped, his eyes flashing. "She's seen more combat than this whole tent combined. She be on the chopper tomorrow." Wand with that the decision was made. Not one officer dared to push back further, not after the way the Major's voice turned like stone on steel, and behind his command was a current of something deeper, something more personal, as if he had just glimpsed the shadow of a legend long thought dead that night. Rachel Keene sat alone in her quarters, the door locked, the light dim, and the silence sharp. She stared at her wrist, the marks staring back like echoes. She could never unhear each line burned in by her own hand, a record not of kills but of survival. And she traced them slowly like someone reciting a prayer one only said when no one else was listening. She remembered them all, not just faces, but the final looks, the last words, the smell of sand and blood and metal, the weight of choices made in seconds, the sound of gunfire in narrow hallways where exits were myths and backup a fantasy, and above all the voice in her head that kept her moving, the voice of someone who had once told her, "You only mark what you can't forget." He was gone now, buried in a place that never made the maps, a casualty of an operation that never existed, and she carried his words like armor, like guilt, like fuel. Next morning the airfield buzzed with the familiar noise of departure rotors, whining soldiers shouting, checklists being called and rechecked, and there she stood in full gear, her rifle slung with the casual familiarity of someone who knew how fast things could go wrong, her eyes behind dark lenses scanning not the horizon but the patterns in the people around her. No one spoke to her at first, not directly, but they glanced her way more often now, some with curiosity, others with wariness, and a few with something like fear, because they had heard what the Major said, and they had begun to wonder what kind of soldier leaves no trace except the ones carved into her own skin and board. The Black Hawk. The Major sat across from her, their knees nearly touching, and for a long time he said nothing. Then finally he leaned forward and spoke low enough that only she could hear. "Operation Winterglass," he said. "You were there." Her head tilted slightly, and she answered. "You weren't." "No," he admitted, "but I read the internal after-action notes before they vanished from the system, and I remember." The summary: one operative confirmed, kill list over 30, team wiped, extraction failed, presumed dead, but your name was not in the file. "Because I wasn't there officially," she said, "because they needed a ghost, not a soldier." Nodded slowly, then looked at her wrist again. "How many of those came from that Op 12, she said quietly. "And one for him." The Major asked. Edge tapped the final mark at the end of the row, the only one etched with a vertical slash through the line, the only one that stood apart, and her voice softened when she said his name. "He was my spotter and my friend, and he didn't run when the signal failed. He held the perimeter while I got the intel out, and he paid for it." Major did not respond right away, only looked out the window as the desert came into view below them, a sweep of sunburnt silence and scattered rock, and he thought of the many names buried under missions that never made headlines, soldiers who fought wars the public would never know happened. And he wondered how many more were still alive, walking quietly among ranks that had no idea what kind of ghost stood beside them. He landed at Forward Base Tigris just past noon, where the heat hit like a hammer and the wind carried the smell of fuel and dust and nerves. The operation was simple on paper: recon of a suspected arms cache hidden beneath a ruined compound with rumored enemy movement in the area. Low risk, high value, except the Major didn't believe in low risk, and neither did Kennedy. Were briefed by local command, who looked at Keene as if she had walked into the wrong room, until the Major introduced her with a single sentence: "This is Lieutenant Keene. She's running point on this." No one questioned it, not after hearing the tone in his voice, but some exchanged glances, wondering what she had done to earn that kind of trust so fast, and the answer, of course, was that none of them had seen the marks on her wrist. By sundown, they moved out, a convoy of 3 vehicles cutting through the sand like slow ships toward a forgotten wreck of stone and steel, and Keen sat in the lead vehicle, her eyes locked forward, her hand resting lightly on her sidearm, her breath slow and steady like someone already counting. Heart. The air inside the compound was thick, people with silence, the kind that stretches before a storm, a silence that made every footstep sound louder, every breath sharper, every shadow more alive. Keen led the way, her body low, her weapon steady, eyes flicking from corner to corner, reading the structure like a language. Only a few ever spoke, the others followed, hesitating just slightly, their movements tight, unsure not of the mission but of the woman in front of them. The compound was old, walls cracked, roofs caved in, but something about it felt wrong, like it had been staged for someone to find, like a set waiting for an actor who never arrived. There were no signs of recent life, no spent shells, no disturbed dust, and yet Keen paused at the doorway of a narrow corridor, her head tilting slightly before she motioned with 2 fingers up and forward. The point man hesitated, and she looked back, her eyes locking with his, until he moved forward past her down the hall where the light narrowed and the tension coiled. Then, just as his boot hit the 3rd tile, the wall behind him blew inward with a low shuddering crack, and the team hit the ground as dust filled the air, and someone shouted, "Contacted." Wasn't an explosion, not a real one, just a concussive trap, a warning, maybe, or a signal, and Keen was already moving through the debris before the dust settled, her voice calm and clipped, calling out positions, calling out angles, and before anyone realized what was happening, she had taken control, not by yelling or pushing, but simply by acting faster, thinking sharper, moving like she had been here before. The Major pulled himself up, coughing hard, his hand on his rifle, and when he saw her silhouette ahead, knife in hand, pistol raised, he didn't question her orders, he followed them because instinct recognized instinct, and he knew this was no longer a recon mission. This was something else, something layered deeper than any briefing had revealed to enemies emerged from the south hallway, both armed, both young, their stances wild, their shots high and wide. Keen dropped one with a controlled burst and closed the distance to the other with terrifying speed. She hit him once, twice, disarmed him, swept his legs, and held the blade to his throat before he even registered the shift, and when he blinked in confusion, she was already pulling intel from his pockets, maps, notes, a burner phone, all of it slid into her pouch with clinical precision. She looked at him once, eyes steady, then walked away, letting him breathe again, not out of mercy, but because she had already judged he wasn't a threat, not the real one anyway. Deeper into the compound, they found rooms with old tech crates marked with serial numbers that had been scratched out, weapons not native to the region, and floor panels slightly raised like they had been opened and closed too many times too recently to ignore. Keen knelt near one such panel, pried it open with her blade, and found what looked like a case of encrypted drives and something else, a medallion with a sigil she recognized immediately. Her hand tightened around it and her breath caught for a split second. It was from her last mission, Winterglass, the one they erased, and the symbol was the same as the one the Black Site commander wore the night they burned everything down. The past was not buried. She realized it had only been moved, repackaged, and left for someone to find. She turned to the Major, who had been watching her, his expression unreadable. "You know what this is," she said quietly, and he nodded. "Yeah, I know, and now we're in the middle of it." Major called an Acitrip to command, but the static was too thick, the signal weak, which meant one of 2 things: either interference or jamming. Either way, they had no backup and no eyes in the sky, and as night fell, the compound took on a different shape, a place no longer abandoned, but waiting. Keen gathered the team in the central chamber, passed out the recovered items, and gave quick instructions, eyes scanning every face. She moved through them like a ghost, quiet, fast, decisive, and they responded like soldiers always did, to strength that didn't ask for permission. One of the younger troops, a private named Henley, approached her cautiously during the lull before their next sweep. He had seen the mark on her wrist during the earlier engagement, and his voice held a question he didn't quite know how to ask. "Mom, those marks on your arm, are they from Missionch looked at him for a long moment, then said, "They're not trophies, they're reminders." Soft, what he asked Softlith at survival has a cost, she replied, and you pay for it whether you win or. Losa nodded and stepped back, not sure if he understood. But knowing it mattered later, just before midnight, they found the second cache buried beneath the floor of what looked like a dining hall. Old tables, overturned broken chairs, and beneath it crates again, but this time guarded 3 enemies waiting. Silent, their rifles raised before the team could react, the firefight broke and Keen moved without hesitation, dropping into cover, sliding across the tile as bullets split the air around her, and the team followed her lead, pushing forward, covering flanks, suppressing and advancing until the threat was down and the crates secure. Inside the final crate was a satchel marked with foreign sigils and a sealed file containing photos, blueprints, and coordinates, and at the bottom a note scrawled in code, the same code she and her spotter used back then, and the message was simple. They're rebuilding. Her hands shook slightly for the first time in years, not from fear but from recognition, and the Major saw it and asked, "What is this?" she said, holding up the paper. "This is proof that the war we thought we ended never stopped." And in her voice was a calm, not of peace but of preparation, because she knew then they had never buried the past, they had only walked away too soon. The team did not sleep that night. They took turns keeping watch, but none of them truly rested. The compound felt different now, as if the walls themselves knew they were being watched from the inside or from far away. No one could tell. Keen sat with her back to the eastern wall, the documents spread in front of her, maps, photographs, coordinates, strings of numbers that made no sense unless you had seen the system once before, and she had years ago when her mission ended in fire and dust. And Silent Che recognized one of the photos. It was a man, older now, with a beard streaked gray and eyes that once belonged to a mentor who betrayed her and her team in Winterglass. He was the one who gave the order to burn the site from orbit, the one who left them behind and reported it a failure, and now here he was alive and apparently rebuilding the machine they all thought was destroyed. The Major crouched beside her and read the files without speaking, his eyes narrowing, his shoulders tense. When he finally looked at her, his voice was flat and steady. "We're going after him, aren't?" Wesh nodded. "Not just him, this whole network. It didn't die, it just went to sleep, and now someone woke it up." The Major stood and looked out into the desert. The dawn was beginning to push against the horizon, a soft gray glow revealing more of the world they were about to walk into, and he turned back to the others, gave the order to move out, and within minutes the team was packed, loaded, and on the trail that would take them far from the safety of command and deep into a region marked restricted on every official map. Sun rose slow and sharp behind them as the trucks rolled through narrow canyons and dry valleys, and Keen kept her eyes on the distance, checking every ridge, every rock formation, as if expecting an ambush, because she was the kind of soldier who did not trust quiet roads or clean skies. And she was right. 2 were 3 hours, and the lead vehicle jerked to a stop and the driver cursed, slamming the brakes and pointing ahead where the trail curved around a narrow pass with black shapes littered across it, too regular to be natural, too symmetrical to be anything but deliberate. Major raised his hand signaling a halt, and Keen was already out, walking carefully toward the shapes. They were decoys, simple metal husks painted to resemble ordnance, meant to slow them or redirect them, and she realized it was working. They were being funneled toward something, not away from it. Scanned the ridge above and saw it, a glint of glass, a reflection of movement, and she shouted down, "Contact left top ridge," and the air exploded with gunfire as the ambush began. The team scattered, seeking cover as rounds poured down from above, and Keen moved like lightning, rolling behind a dune, returning fire, marking targets, calling ranges, her voice calm and sharp, and the Major followed her lead, not questioning, not hesitating, just trusting her instinct as if it had never failed before. It was soldiers went down, hit in the legs and one in the shoulder, and Keen reached the wounded under fire, dragging them back with strength that defied her frame, and every time someone faltered she was there pulling them forward, cursing softly under her breath, as if refusing to let death have even one morsel. They pushed through the canyon, eventually outflanked the shooters and drove them back, and when the dust settled there were 3 dead and 1 captured, and Keen stared at the prisoner for a long time before removing his mask and whispering something only he seemed to understand because his face went pale, and he began to talk fast in a dialect only she knew. Later she told the major what he said. "They're watching us," he said. "We're getting too close and they'll burn the trail." Like before, the major's face tightened, and he looked at the sky half expecting a drone strike or worse, and then he asked her quietly, "How long do you think we have?" Keen looked at the coordinates in the file, looked at the mountains ahead, then said, "A day, maybe two, before they disappear again." They buried the dead, patched the wounded, and moved on faster now. No breaks, no second guesses, because the window was closing and the target W. Keen stared at the terminal, the glow of the screen casting sharp lines across her face, her breath held in her chest, not from fear, but from something colder, a recognition deeper than blood. The words "welcome back" pulsed once more, and then faded, replaced by a single line of coordinates blinking slowly, and then the screen went black. The major stepped beside her, rifle lowered, his voice quiet but firm. "Do you know what this means?" She nodded once, eyes never leaving the blank terminal. "It means he's alive, and he wants me to find him." The team set up a quick perimeter while the techs pulled whatever data they could from the server's files, dumped onto drives, schematic fragments, patterns, layers of a plan that went beyond anything they had seen before. Not just insurgency, but full psychological warfare, sleeper cells, media distortions, supply line sabotage, everything designed with precision, the kind only someone inside the system could execute. One, the last drive was loaded and the final backup completed. Keen took one last look around the bunker, her eyes scanning every bolt, every light, every inch of wiring, like she could read the history of it in the walls. Then without a word she turned and walked out into the night. They moved quickly through the desert, guided now by the new coordinates, deep into the borderlands, a stretch of scorched earth where signals died and maps lost all meaning. And still Keen pressed forward, her pace relentless, as if her body was no longer powered by muscle and bone, but by memory and ghosts. They reached the site by sunrise, a single shack on a wind-swept ridge, no visible patrols, no wires, no traps, just a door slightly ajar and a dust trail leading away into the hills. Keen approached slowly, hand on her side arm, her shadow long in the early light, and when she pushed the door open, the silence was absolute. Inside was nothing but a cot, steel desk, a single chair, and a wall covered in notes, maps, sketches, some written in her own hand from years ago, things only two people ever knew, things that had burned in winter glass, or so she thought. Stepped closer, scanning each page until her fingers found a torn photograph tucked under a knife, and when she pulled it free, her heart stopped. It was her NM taken before the mission, before everything, when they still smiled, when they still believed in what they were doing. Behind her, the major entered slowly, his eyes sweeping the room until they landed on the photo in her hand, and the look he gave her was not one of surprise, but of understanding. "Left this for you," he said softly. "Not for us, for Yao." Keen nodded again barely, and then pointed to the map on the wall where one location had been circled 3 times. In red ink, a mountain range marked with an X and a single word beneath it. Last, the team moved again, fast, this time dropping all non-essential gear, traveling light, because whatever was waiting at the final location would not be a conversation. It would be a reckoning, and Keen was ready for it. They reached the base of the mountains by nightfall and made camp under the cover of rock, the stars above them cold and endless, and no one spoke much, not even the rookies, because the air around them felt thick, people with something ancient, a kind of stillness that only came before storms or ants. Where Keen sat apart from the group, sharpening her blade slowly, eyes fixed on the fire, and in her mind she replayed the last day at Winterglass, the screams, the betrayal, the silence that followed, and the last time she saw his face bleeding and smiling and whispering. Run. When morning broke, they climbed, moving higher into the stone ribs of the world where drones could not fly and satellites could not see, and after hours of ascent they reached a plateau where a single building, weighted metal and stone, fused into the mountain like it had grown there instead of being built. No guards, no locks, no traps, just a door and a keypad. And when Keen approached, The panel lit up and asked for a code, and without thinking she entered a sequence burned into her memory: the day they graduated, the last mission date, the number of names they never said out loud. A door opened with a hiss and inside was darkness, followed by the low hum of power, and when the lights flickered on she saw him was standing at the far end of the chamber, older, bearded, his eyes sunken and sharp, and when he saw her he smiled, but it was not a smile of joy, it was something else. "Something wounded and defiant you found me," he said quietly. "You left me," she replied, and her voice was steel and smoke. "He saved you," he said, and gestured to the wall behind him where screens lit up showing data, charts, names, coordinates, and the web of a network they thought was dead. And he stepped forward slowly, not as a threat, but as a man carrying too many truths. "I stayed behind to kill it from within, and I failed. They rebuilt around me, used my designs, my systems. I couldn't stop them." Elonathan, "Why bring me here?" she asked, her eyes narrowing, her hand resting near her weapon. "Because," he said, "I need you to finish it, and you're the only one who can't." Major entered behind her, rifle half-raised, eyes never leaving the man, and the room felt like a wire pulled too tight, waiting for something to snap. "You expect us to trust you?" he asked, his tone cold and clear. "No," the man said, "I expect you to see that this doesn't end with me, it ends with all of us, or not." Keen walked forward, slowly stopping just feet away from him, her eyes scanning him for lies, for shadows, for anything she missed, and then, without warning, she raised her hand and struck him once across the facet. "That's for Winterglass," she said, nodded once, didn't flinch, and whispered, "I deserved that." Behind them the screens flashed again, one name pulsing red, and Keen turned to look, and when she saw it her face went still. It was a name from the original list, someone they thought dead, someone she had buried herself, and now they were back and leading the rebuilt network. She turned to the Major and said, "We finish this now," and he nodded because there was no turning back. The screens glowed red with the name that should not have been there, the name that had been carved into the wall of the dead, the name that once belonged to the one who led them through the blood and shadows and who was last seen falling into fire. And now that name pulsed on the screen, not as a memory but as a command node, as a living signal. At the center of everything they had uncovered, Keen stood still, the room humming around her, the weight of 10 years pressing down on her spine. She thought she had buried the past under sand and silence, but it had grown in the dark like roots twisting through steel, and now it reached for her again, not with rage, but with something worse, understanding. The man across from her, her old partner, her old ghost, moved to the console, began typing strings of code, opening tunnels through data, blacked out networks, revealing the bones of an operation that had never truly died. It had just changed. Masks moved to quieter wars and sharper tools, and Keen could see now that this was not just about revenge, it was about unfinished orders. Major moved closer, watching the screens, mapping the nodes, tracking the signals, each one a location, a cell, a heartbeat of a network still breathing and expanding, and in the center that name still flashing like a Dario said. "She was dead," he said without turning. He watched her fall. Keen answered, and her voice was low like gravel soaked in memory. "But I never found the body." "You think she built this?" the Major asked, "or inherited it?" Keen looked at the architecture of the code, the design of the traps, the redundancies, and saw fingerprints she had studied once in training and again in combat. These were not echoes, they were signatures. "No," she said, "she built it, and she's waiting." They moved fast, then every piece of intel loaded, every location flagged, every asset burned. They would not send this back to command. It was too late for that, too big, too dangerous. They would strike now with what they had, with the team that remained, with the old ghost who once betrayed them and now stood ready to die beside them. Target was buried deep in a city that had no name on any map, a ghost district built for shadows and left to rot. It was where black programs went to breathe and where failures were erased without funerals, and it was there that the signal pulsed strongest. They entered at night under false papers and forged identities, weapons hidden behind tech gear and medical crates. The team split into 3 groups, each taking a vector toward the core of the signal, and Keen moved like she had been born For this every step precise, every glance calculated, her pulse steady, her hand never shaking. Inside the complex it was colder than outside, to clean, to quiet, the air recycled and dry, the kind of silence that only came from rooms where people used to scream, and now only machines remained. They found the mainframe at the center of the structure, 5 levels below, street access surrounded by defenses designed to kill quietly, but they were not quiet. They moved fast, loud, controlled, chaos breaching. With shock charges, smoke, and flash descending into the dark like wolves with old debts, Tekalekian reached the control room first. Doors blasted open by shaped charges, glass shattered underfoot, and at the center of the room, sitting behind a glowing desk, was the woman who should have been dead. Her hair was shorter now, her face leaner, but the eyes were the same, sharp and cold and endless, and when she saw Keen she smiled as if no time had passed. "Hello, Lieutenant," she said. "You burned." "U.S. Keen said, and stepped into the room, weapon raised, her voice flat and full of ash. "You left us for dead, and yet here you are," the woman replied, still standing, still loyal. "We build this," Keen asked. "Why come back? Why wear their skin after what they did to U.S. best? The war never ended," the woman said, and her voice was calm, not angry, just full of certainty. "They just stopped calling it one." Keen stepped closer, the rifle in her hand steady. "Boo."